First, the US accused Burkina Faso's leader of stealing gold. Then, the same general turned around and called him a visionary. Why did the West go from attacking Captain Ibrahim Traore to admiring him? What happened behind the scenes that forced a powerful American general to backtrack? General Michael Langley, head of U.S. Africa Command, leaned forward and spoke with the calm assurance of someone who believed he was untouchable. With cameras rolling, Langley stated that Captain Ibrahim Traore, the transitional president of Burkina Faso, was using the country's nationalized gold reserves to entrench military control rather than uplift the Burkinabe people. It sounded diplomatic, calculated, and rehearsed, but it struck like a slap across the face. There was no proof cited, no context offered, no balancing of perspectives. Just a bold accusation that Traoré was hoarding national wealth for his power. And at that moment, something snapped. Not in Langley, but in Africa. Across the continent, the statement was heard for what it truly was. Not just an attack on one leader, but a reassertion of a colonial worldview. One in which African leaders are scolded like misbehaving children. One in which resource control is only respected when it serves Western markets. One in which African sovereignty is conditional, allowed only when it complies with foreign expectations. But this wasn't 1965. This was 2025. And this time, the backlash came loud, swift, and digital. Within hours, the quote began circulating on social media, translated into French, Arabic, Swahili, and dozens of local dialects. Influencers, journalists, and political activists began picking it apart. Was the gold not Burkina Faso's to control? Was the country not within its sovereign rights to nationalize its resources? And who was this foreign general to question it, sitting thousands of miles away? Then came the headlines. Not just in Africa, but across the global south. Stories framed Langley's words as another Western attack on African independence. Commentators in Mali, Senegal, Ghana, and the DRC pointed to the long history of foreign interference cloaked in polite language. This, they argued, was the latest insult. What made it even worse? The fact that Burkina Faso had already made headlines in the previous year by expelling foreign military bases, asserting economic control over gold, and pushing for a new regional alliance that rejected Western aid dependency. Captain Traoré had become a symbol, young, confident, military-trained, and unapologetically Pan-African. To insult him was to insult a movement, and the reaction was fierce. In Ouagadougou, young activists held signs reading, "Hands off our gold" and "Langley, who owns Africa?" Demonstrations broke out not just in Burkina Faso but across borders. In neighboring Mali, artists painted murals of Traoré crushing Western puppets. In Chad, student leaders organized forums dissecting Langley's comments as a case study in neo-colonial rhetoric. Even longtime critics of Traoré, who disagreed with his militarized leadership style, found common ground in rejecting foreign humiliation. The controversy had done something rare. It unified political rivals, at least momentarily, under the shared banner of dignity. But it wasn't just symbolic. Behind the scenes, African diplomats began sending quiet but firm signals to U.S. embassies. Sources say back-channel meetings were held, expressing deep dissatisfaction. A few African ministers even threatened to walk out of scheduled regional security talks unless Langley corrected himself. By the end of the month, the narrative had shifted entirely. Langley, once positioned as a top American expert on Africa, was now the face of Western arrogance. And while U.S. officials scrambled to contain the fallout, Traoré didn't need to say much. His silence spoke volumes. He had already won the narrative war, without lifting a finger. What started as a sentence intended to shame him had instead made him a martyr for the cause of economic independence and African self-rule. Langley had, perhaps unintentionally, poured gasoline on the fire of a growing movement. But behind every public firestorm lies a private calculation. And in Langley's case, it wouldn't be long before pressure began to mount. Not just from abroad, but from within his circles. Because when a storm like this hits, someone has to clean up the mess. And that's where the story turns. The outcry had peaked. Across African capitals and online circles, Langley's name had become synonymous with insult, arrogance, and the old imperial voice many thought had been buried. But what the cameras didn't catch, and what most headlines didn't explore, was the internal panic within the U.S. defense and diplomatic apparatus. While the protests made noise, it was the silence from governments that spoke louder. Behind closed doors, regional allies stopped returning calls. Intelligence sharing slowed. Invitations to upcoming joint security summits were quietly withdrawn. Diplomatic staff in embassies across West Africa began sending urgent cables back to Washington, noting a cooling climate and growing diplomatic fatigue toward U.S. engagement in the Sahel. Langley hadn't just offended Burkina Faso. He had alienated an entire region that was already drifting away from American influence. Langley's staff, according to insiders, advised damage control, and not the kind that hides behind policy language, but the kind that calls for a direct and public reversal. But this wasn't just about optics. There was something deeper, something raw. Langley, trained for combat, structured strategy, and command, was now outflanked not by soldiers, but by the ideology of African self-determination. He hadn't misread the map, he'd misread the moment. In his circle, pressure mounted not only from African affairs specialists, but from national security advisors watching China and Russia make bold diplomatic moves across the continent. Those two powers hadn't said a word about Traoré's gold policies. They didn't need to. Their silence was strategic. It allowed African leaders to assert control without fear of reprimand. Meanwhile, America's military boss had walked into the room swinging, and now Washington needed someone to clean up the mess. So, the general blinked. A statement was drafted. Sources close to defense leadership suggest it went through multiple revisions, each time toned down further, trying to sound sincere without sounding weak. Eventually, the message was made public. Langley acknowledged that his earlier words were rooted in misjudgment, made without full context, and that external pressures had influenced his analysis. To the untrained eye, it was a sterile correction, but in Africa it was read as capitulation. The continent, that had been treated as a geopolitical chessboard for decades, had just forced a powerful American general to publicly retreat. In Langley's apology, analysts began to read desperation, not the collapse of American power, but the realization that the American tone would no longer go unchecked. Africa was no longer flinching when accused. It was demanding respect or silence. And so, in an odd twist of irony, Langley's climb down became the very thing he had tried to avoid, a symbolic surrender. But apologies are one thing, reputational recovery is another. Washington knew it couldn't stop at sorry. It needed to reverse the damage. It needed to win back Burkina Faso's trust, and by extension, influence the broader Sahel narrative before it slipped away for good. That's when something strange began to happen. Langley didn't just apologize, he started to praise. And that moment marked the beginning of a transformation so bizarre, it made some wonder if America had genuinely changed its stance, or simply learned to wear a softer mask. He acknowledged bold steps toward development and sovereignty. And just like that, the same man who had painted Traoré as a threat was now decorating him with compliments. But here's what made it strange. Traoré had not changed. Langley had. There were no new elections. No reforms demanded by Washington. No softened stances from Ouagadougou. If anything, Traoré had grown bolder, tightening control over the economy, consolidating state institutions, and doubling down on the nationalization of gold, energy, and even agricultural production. He was moving further from the Western economic playbook, not closer. Yet Langley's tone flipped like a weather vane in a windstorm. To seasoned observers, this wasn't praise, it was positioning. Langley hadn't suddenly seen the light. He had seen the map. And on that map, Burkina Faso was no longer a pawn. It was a symbol. A country that, despite sanctions, diplomatic distance, and media criticism, had not only survived, it had begun building a parallel model of governance that rejected Western dependency altogether. In short, Traoré had become too big to dismiss. Langley's rebrand didn't happen in a vacuum. It mirrored a broader realization dawning in the U.S. foreign policy establishment. The traditional tactics of influence, military aid, conditional support, IMF strings, were no longer effective in countries that had tasted self-reliance and liked it. Worse, in the vacuum left by Western retreat, new players were moving in. Russia was expanding defense ties. China was laying down infrastructure, fiber optics, and offering trade without lectures. Turkey and Iran were negotiating cultural and technological exchanges. Even small countries like Serbia and Indonesia had opened new diplomatic lines to West African capitals. The West wasn't just losing narrative control, it was losing access. That's why Langley's pivot matters. It wasn't about Burkina Faso alone. It was about salvaging influence before it collapsed entirely. By praising Traoré, the US hoped to project flexibility. See, the message implied, we can work with your kind of leadership. We understand local models. We respect your independence. But the problem with that approach is that everyone remembered what happened just weeks earlier. No one forgot the accusations. No one forgot the condescension. And while the praise sounded diplomatic, it also sounded desperate. For Burkina Faso's government, Langley's compliments were met with cool professionalism. Traoré issued no gushing statements of gratitude. There was no photo op, no press conference celebrating the reconciliation. Just business as usual, more state investment in local industries, more military coordination with non-Western allies, and more declarations that Burkina Faso would stand on its terms. In that silence, Traoré sent his message. Validation was irrelevant. Victory had already been secured. But beneath the surface, Langley's shift was having ripple effects. Other African leaders, particularly in Mali, Guinea, and Niger, saw the sequence unfold. First comes the accusation. Then comes the backlash. Then, if you don't budge, comes the respect. It was a blueprint, a proof of concept. Refuse to kneel, and the empire comes to your feet. In diplomatic circles, some even began referring to Traoré not just as a leader, but as a diplomatic force field. Any attack on him had to be calculated because the response wouldn't just come from Burkina Faso. It would come from a continental wave of public opinion that the West had not yet learned how to predict or control. And so, Langley's rebrand became more than a personal reversal. It became a signal of changing power dynamics. It told the world that the age of one-sided diplomacy was cracking. That African nations, when united by sovereignty and unapologetic self-interest, could not only resist pressure, but reverse it. Still, a lingering question remains. Was Langley's praise sincere? Or was it just another performance in a long play of strategic containment? Because in geopolitics, a compliment isn't always admiration. Sometimes it's camouflage. And in this case, it might be hiding the next move America is planning to stay relevant in a world where Africa is no longer silent or small. General Langley's shift in tone didn't occur in isolation. It wasn't just about Burkina Faso or Traoré, or even the fallout from a poorly judged Senate testimony. It was the tip of something larger, something tectonic, something that revealed just how uncertain America's footing in Africa had become. Because while Langley was praising Traoré in public, a deeper anxiety was unfolding in private. The United States is no longer the default power on the African continent, and Washington knows it. For decades, U.S. influence in Africa was enforced through three levers: military cooperation, development aid, and diplomatic prestige. That old structure assumed Africa needed the West more than the West needed Africa. But something flipped. And the most uncomfortable part for Washington? It didn't happen with bullets. It happened with choices. African leaders, especially in the Sahel, are no longer looking west by default. They're looking east, south, and sometimes inward. They're building ties with Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, India, Brazil, and even lesser-known players like Malaysia and Indonesia. And unlike Western partners, these new alliances come with no lectures, no political conditions, no attached morality. That is the threat Washington is quietly scrambling to contain. Langley's compliments may have sounded diplomatic, but they masked a growing panic. What if America is simply not needed anymore? Take Russia, for example. Moscow is making deep inroads into African military structures, not just through state visits and weapons deals, but through security pacts, training missions, and counterinsurgency collaborations. Unlike the US, Russia doesn't demand reforms in return. It simply shows up, asks what's needed, and delivers it. For many African governments, that's the kind of respect they've long been denied. China plays a different but equally effective game. Its strategy is economic. Roads, railways, ports, power plants, digital infrastructure, all built, often financed and maintained through bilateral agreements. No public criticisms, no conditional grants, no annual reports questioning internal affairs. China treats African leaders like equal partners in development, not case studies for improvement. And then there's the silent diplomacy of smaller but rising players. The Gulf states are investing in African agriculture and logistics. India is expanding digital health systems. Brazil is forging educational partnerships. Each of them is offering something America cannot, a relationship built on mutual need, not historic guilt. The U.S., by contrast, seems stuck between two conflicting instincts. On one hand, it wants to present itself as a supportive ally, respectful of sovereignty. On the other hand, it struggles to let go of its habit of dictating the terms of engagement. Langley's initial accusation against Traoré was a perfect example of that contradiction, a moment where the mask slipped and the old tone returned. When it backfired, the strategy changed. But the problem is, Africa noticed. Everyone noticed. Even American think tanks, usually cautious in tone, are beginning to admit that the U.S. is no longer the only game in town, that its military bases don't guarantee loyalty, that its funding doesn't ensure influence, that its criticisms don't provoke compliance, they provoke backlash. And this brings us back to Langley's rebrand. What looked like a personal course correction was, in many ways, a field test of a larger pivot. Can the United States remain relevant in a multipolar Africa without controlling the conversation? The early results aren't promising. While Langley talked about positive developments in Burkina Faso, Traoré was busy negotiating with non-Western powers on gold refinement, food security, and joint infrastructure development. While U.S. diplomats discussed rebuilding trust, Burkina Faso's youth were holding cultural summits celebrating Pan-African unity and rejecting the legacy of Bretton Woods. In short, Africa was already moving on. Langley's praise didn't bring Burkina Faso back into the Western fold. It simply acknowledged a new reality. The U.S. can no longer pressure its way into influence. It must now compete, on equal terms, with nations that respect Africa's choices, even if they don't always align with Western interests. This isn't just a regional pivot, it's a global reset. Burkina Faso, once seen as peripheral in world politics, is now a case study in post-colonial assertion. And Traoré, by standing firm in the face of public condemnation, has become a reference point for other African leaders who are tired of being managed. The world is no longer unipolar, and Africa, long treated as a chessboard, is now playing its own game, with new pieces, new allies, and new rules. But will the West accept this shift, or will it keep pretending nothing has changed? That question leads us to the final piece of the puzzle. What happens when African leaders, not just Traoré, start calling the shots on a global scale? For decades, Africa was studied, advised, surveyed, lectured, and managed. Every policy decision was guided, every budget monitored, every election observed. Western powers defined the rules, and African nations were expected to play along. But something has changed, and perhaps no moment captured that shift better than a U.S. general apologizing to a 35-year-old African military leader, and then, almost overnight, applauding him. To some, this moment feels like diplomacy. To others, it feels like a mask. But for a growing number of African thinkers, activists, and leaders, it feels like a long-delayed acknowledgement of who's really in control now. Let's be clear, General Langley didn't lose his position. He didn't face public disciplinary action. But he did something far more symbolic. He bowed rhetorically to a man the West had tried to discredit. And in that subtle shift, from confrontation to compliment, a deeper current was revealed. One that shows how Africa is no longer waiting to be led. It's leading itself, and the world is adjusting. The paranoia now simmering in Washington and Brussels isn't about one gold policy or one leader's assertiveness. It's about the growing realization that Africa no longer needs to explain itself. It doesn't need permission to nationalize its resources. It doesn't need a green light to pursue defense pacts with non-Western powers. It doesn't need to mimic foreign systems of democracy to be seen as legitimate. Many African governments are beginning to ask an even more radical question. Why mimic at all? In Burkina Faso, Traoré has quietly demonstrated what happens when a nation governs on its terms and doesn't collapse. Western analysts predicted economic chaos when the country nationalized gold. It didn't happen. they forecast political instability after military consolidation. Instead, Traoré's approval ratings rose. They warned of diplomatic isolation. But what followed were new partnerships from unexpected places. And now, the same West that warned against this path is trying to get back in the room, with polite applause and strategic smiles. But the applause isn't echoed everywhere. Within Western institutions, there's a quiet but growing fear that the entire model of engagement with Africa is collapsing, not because it was defeated in open battle, but because it's being ignored. African states are forming new regional alliances, building currency alternatives, holding their peace talks, and coordinating security without Western oversight. There's no official declaration of independence. There doesn't need to be. The declaration is in the behavior. You can hear it in the language African leaders are using. Partnership, not assistance. Sovereignty, not conditionality. Cooperation, not compliance. You can see it in the way summits are hosted. In the past, African presidents flew to Europe to receive pledges. Now, Europe flies in, trying to catch up. And increasingly, they leave with vague promises instead of guaranteed influence. The shift is emotional too. There's pride returning, a cultural awakening, a belief that the continent's future doesn't lie in fixing Western-designed systems, but in building African-designed ones. From banking to education, security to media, Africa is experimenting with its models. Some will fail. Others will transform the landscape entirely. But the point is this: the experiment is happening without external permission. So when Langley praised Traoré, it wasn't just a diplomatic olive branch. It was an unspoken admission. The days of lecturing Africa are over. Now, the West must listen, or be left behind. But this creates an entirely new dynamic, one filled with uncertainty. What happens when the West no longer calls the shots in Africa? When it can't leverage aid, frame narratives, or dictate development? It is already happening, and it is making Africa strong. Do you think Africa should be scared of becoming sovereign? Will having no Western aid be better? Let us know in the comment section, what would you choose for Africa?